Okay, I think we're good. Okay, well, in that case, welcome back everyone from break. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Ferris, who will be chairing the cybersecurity panel. Dr. Ferris is a professor of history and a fellow of the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. He has written 4 monographs and 120 articles on issues including history of power politics during the interwar years and in the Asia Pacific region, and the history in the air, diplomatic, military, naval, imperial, intelligence, and international history, and strategic studies. In particular, he is a specialist in the history of signals and cyber intelligence. He was historical scholar in residence at the United States' National Security Agency from 2008 to 2009, and is the author of Behind the Enigma, the authorized history of GCHQ, Britain's secret cyber intelligence agency. So welcome, Dr. Ferris, and I will leave the floor to you to introduce the panel and get us kicked off here.
Good. I'll try to keep this brief, and the reason I asked about the circulation of Alexander Rudolph's bio is I'm going to assume that the bios have been read by everyone, and therefore I won't say a huge amount about the background. Cyber clearly is one of the most dynamic, and I'd say little known areas of modern strategy and strategic studies. It's an area where I think we're only now really beginning to have a clear grasp of how it will be used in power politics by states, let alone by individual people. And what we're dealing with are 3 papers which address various aspects of cyber, and they do it, I think, from very good and distinct positions. Now, I'm presuming that our first speaker is going to be Alexander Rudolf because he's replacing someone who was #1. And what I'll briefly do is to say that Alexander Rudolf is a PhD candidate in Department of Political Science at Carleton. He has a multidisciplinary background, as well as much work in the private sector. And both his experiences and studies lead him to know a great deal about the area of cyber. And he's going to be focusing really on Russian cyber operations with some reference to items that are happening today. Our second presenter is Eduardo Izycki, who again has a great deal of practical experience and much academic experience in elements of cyber. He has had graduate work in King's in London, a very good school, I might say, as well as working for the Brazilian state in a number of different areas in cyber issues. And what he'll be dealing with is really the issue of cyber proliferation, which is one of the many different areas of significance in the field we're dealing with. And finally, last but not least, we have Sean Lawlor, who is a computer engineering student at the Royal Military College of Canada. He's is interested in cyber as well as other things. And I suspect that what we're really looking at from Sean's point of view will be how Canada could and should be dealing with cyber. And what he's going to be dealing with is a very important issue, which is exactly what are the consequences of an inadequate response in advance to potential cyber threats. And I suppose, how do we define adequacy of defense and whether defense on its own is actually even possible in cyber? Now, my instructions are to ensure that ideally speakers stick to 10 minutes. I'm allowed to throw in a few extra minutes out of generosity, but at a certain stage, if people are not concluding, it's over. We're moving to the next person. So aim, please, for 10 minutes. You can have 12 if you're really very nice. I think what we'll do is begin with Alexander Rudolf, and then turn to Eduardo Izycki, and end up finally with Sean Lawlor. So, Alexander.
All right, thank you. And let me just see if I can present, since I have a PowerPoint. I do not think I have the option available to me. Here it is.
Christopher,
All right, thank you, Dr. Ferris, for the introduction. And thank you to the organizers for reaching out. I'm happy to fill in last minute. And bear in mind, as last minute, I completed this PowerPoint last night. So let's see how I do. So as mentioned, I will be presenting on doctrine broadly and what doctrine tells us about Russian cyber operations against Ukraine. And so first, I'll begin to kind of frame what I specifically look at. And so I look at cyber statecraft, and as I will go in detail later on, cybercraft. And what this means is I look at the means for which a state achieves its strategic objectives in cyberspace. But in particular, I'm most interested in cyber force structures, or those institutions and organizations to project force and power in cyberspace. And also doctrine. And principally, doctrine is about more or less guiding principles to motivate action to achieve military objectives. In certain parlance and ways, I describe it as military norms as a way, not necessarily hard rules, but guidelines to motivate action. And this doctrine is really what is behind much of what the military does. And what doctrine really does is formalize certain thinking in the military about achieving certain goals. And in studying doctrine, much of what I do is look at the history of strategic thought and kind of what this allows us to understand about cyber conflict. And really this begins back in the 1990s when people were all of a sudden realizing there were security dimensions to cyberspace, even though it developed along security dimensions, and started screaming that cyber war is coming. But come late 2000s, as US Cybercom stood up and as we started seeing the application of cyber operations, the likes of Thomas Rid came in to usher in a golden age of cyber war literature, saying we don't really need to be worried about cyber war and it's quintessentially not coming. But now today, we're kind of in this lapse of not really understanding where we quite are. There's a lot of great work being done, but it's very hit and miss, kind of all over the place. And there really isn't a central thought to what cyber warfare or cyber conflict is. And so that's where my kind of exploration is. Has this golden age of cyber war really won? Is there really no such thing as cyber war? But if this is the case, why is everyone still kind of expecting cyber war to exist? That even if cyber war really isn't a thing, then is it the media perpetuating this, or is it really the literature or the military? But really, I would go back to the person that supposedly answered this, Thomas Rid. As much as I would claim that he is at the forefront of thinking and is very essential to understanding that cyber conflict isn't cyber war or war in the traditional sense, but we need to think of it in a grounded understanding of what warfare is. But his conclusions and arguments don't necessarily fully line up. So what Rid ultimately argues, using Clausewitz and Carl von Clausewitz, military theorist, who fundamentally argues that war is all about the politics. And of course, I'm glossing over so much here, but this is really the base of what Thomas Rid uses. And the three main points that Clausewitz puts forth in what Rid says is that war is violent, and Rid argues that cyber can't be used for physical violence, which isn't true, that it's not instrumental, that you cannot achieve an ends with cyber, also not true, and that it's not political because cyber is secretive and not overt, that it's not war in a traditional sense. And we can go back and forth all day about the theoretical implications of this, but let's look at what is actually going on right now. What is Russia doing in Ukraine? And is all of these headlines that claim there isn't a cyber war, are these actually true? And if we take even a cursory look, it doesn't really hold up. So if we look at just the past few months at a kind of major malware that has hit Ukraine specifically, it seems very targeted. So the first item that came out in January called Whispergate, that it presented itself as a ransomware, but in actuality was trying to wipe and corrupt hard drives in Ukraine. This was both intimidation, believed to, with the ransomware, had messages to intimidate the population, but also it was destructive to try and destroy data. Come February, another one hit just hours before the invasion that is regarded as very well written, that uses drivers, abuses drivers to gain access to a system, and targeted a lot of government and infrastructure, particularly banks and ATMs. And just this week, another one called Caddy Wiper, that this one appears a bit rushed, that it was deployed the same day that it appeared to be written. So there appears to be an active process here, and all of these are specifically targeting Ukraine. So something is really going on, but is this everything? Not really. There is quite a bit going on the surface that we can visibly see, and as Brigadier General Lambert alluded to, the Canadian government and NATO partners are very much ready if need be, which in this space means they are watching, and from threat intelligence in the area, many actors are watching what's going on in Ukrainian space right now. And so as we see that there's a greater dimension to the cyber components and cyber conflict here, a few fallacies begin to emerge. First, if a capability or exploit exists, it will always be used in the event of war, always. That many people seem to think that if something exists, that it will be used. And the fact that nuclear weapons do exist and have been used very little proves this otherwise. And that the only approach in cyber warfare or cyber conflict is a technical tool or malware. But as the general noted, information warfare is very much part of this. And ultimately, the fallacy that there is no such thing as cyber war. But the truth is that there is no such thing as cyber war. The fact is there's just cyber conflict. And the fact remains that capabilities do not create doctrine, but that we need to understand how to use the instruments that we have. That if we go back to the early 1900s with the emergence of planes in warfare, we had some theorists saying that we just need a massive plane to just fly in and that will solve all war. That the point is we need to stop thinking about hyperbole and look at what is actually done with these capabilities. And not only is it about these capabilities, but the methods of using them. And so it's at this point we begin understanding it's about more of a practice. And so this is where cybercraft comes in. That cybercraft is the skillful management of cyber ways and means to achieve your ends. So in some ways, it can be viewed like statecraft or tradecraft, and can be applied along various dimensions of diplomatic, information, military, and economics. That we simply cannot think narrowly on military dimensions. As, again, as the general noted, he works with many partners. In democracies, it looks like working with other institutions, where in Russian doctrine and operations, it can often be one and the same. And so, as I mentioned, this emphasizes the practice and activity of cyber rather than specific operations and capabilities, and about how to use these, what these practices and activity means in terms of doctrine. And this doctrine becomes an important variable in threat intelligence. And so, as we begin to apply this, getting short on time, I recognize, so I'll try and wrap this up shortly. From this, we begin to see how this is applied in Ukraine. That if we pull back, remember those wiper malwares that targeted Ukraine, that they specifically sought to intimidate Ukraine to capitulate to Russian demands and sought to cripple the government and civil society and deny freedom of movement when Russia has sought a quick and easy victory to simply kill the president and leadership of Ukraine and install their own vassal. And the wipers that have been implemented appear to support these ends. And so our outcome are a few things. First, the specific limited rushed operations to destroy data across Ukraine is specifically there to deny Ukraine its ability to simply operate as a state. And the attempts to, Russia's information operations are fundamentally to support that first objective to degrade the legitimacy of Ukraine. And ultimately, bad logistics and planning also affects cyber. That a former NSA operator amusingly noted that the best offensive security doesn't come down to the team, but the managers of these teams. So when you have Russian intelligence more concerned about their ransomware groups that are giving them kickbacks, they're not necessarily concerned about, in the event that a war does occur, that they have the means to conduct operations to make a great impact. Less than a minute, so I'll try and quickly wrap up. And we see that they are using a lot of great access, but they are rushing to use what access they do have with exploits that aren't necessarily getting off the ground, along with remembering that NATO has been helping Ukraine, along with Ukraine is actually well-versed in cybersecurity. And end it here with a few traits to remember that once a war occurs and bullets begin to fly, cyber is still there, but our concern for it goes down because people aren't being killed with cyber. And this is important because we shouldn't be as concerned for cyber once the bullets actually begin to be fired. Capabilities ultimately follow doctrine. Cyber is messy and will be underwhelming, and a lot more can be used, but we might have to question, will it? All right, at that, thank you everyone. Welcome your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a cogent and well-informed presentation. Now I'd like to call on Eduardo Izycki to carry us forward with his presentation. Thank you very much, Eduardo.
Oh, thank you, Professor. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just share my screen, my presentation. In a cybersecurity panel, sharing screens is always a challenge. Okay, so you guys can see my presentation. So thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the opportunity to have to share a bit of my research. I'm going to discuss my research on cyber offensive capabilities, focusing mainly on the proliferation and its consequences to international security. I just point out that this is entirely academic research, not related to my previous work in the Brazilian government, just to point that out. And as most of our ideas in research, we usually begin with a question, and I think the question I made myself a few years ago, back in 2018, when I began this, was, well, that's a lot of media coverage on cyber conflict, cyber war, as Alexander pointed out, whether it is war or not. But what exactly is happening in cyberspace? And I think one of the first questions one of the first answers we always get is that the narrow view of traditional powers. So cyberspace is relatively new, but we do have traditional powers. We have the US, China, Russia, Iran, and so forth. And we tend to focus our attention on those players, mainly because cybersecurity companies, for instance, tend to focus on those particular state actors. There's, of course, a realm of non-state actors, but in my research in this presentation, I'm going to focus strictly on state capabilities. And coming from Latin America, despite being here in London and in King's College, I also had a strategic view with a different point, thinking about, well, there are other players out there. And that struck me back in 1718 when I saw, for instance, reports of Lebanon and Vietnamese threat actors being considered state-sponsored groups. So who else is active in cyberspace? So this was my first driver here. And to answer that question, what I did, I tried to build, and I successfully built a data set of cyber incidents and cyber capabilities related to state-sponsored activity. And I had three major sources of information. First of all, technical reports provided by companies, cybersecurity companies, and national CSIRTs, incident response centers. So highly technical, describing APTs, advanced persistent threats. Alongside that, lots of reports about from universities and NGOs. For instance, Citizen Lab in Canada, it's one of them, from the University of Toronto. And they focus mostly on digital privacy, human rights, all very relevant, of course, with technical details also being shared. And they also perform some level of attribution in many cases. And the third was quite interesting to see how much information was available considering data breaches. And the victims here were the attackers themselves, the threat actors being hacked, so to speak. So you have beginning with the Finfisher hacking in 2014, hacking team, and then Vault 7 from CIA being shared on WikiLeaks. And we have several cases like that that shared many precious data points for my research. And I clustered all this information in two major kinds of events. The first one would be the cyber incidents themselves, the attacks, so to speak, where an actual breach happened, something was described as an actual attack. And the other situations where the data didn't point to an attack that happened, but on the presence or acquisition of cyber offensive capabilities. And I mean by cyber offensive capabilities in a broad sense, being just the spywares being sold by private sector, as well as the tools being leaked. For instance, in the shadow brokers incident that happened back in 2017. So I broadly clustered the information in those two kinds of incidents. So what I did, just to point out, I know this is not a computer science group, but to point it out, I wrote a Python script and looked for data sources on the internet, scrapped the information. Whenever I found a document to be relevant and important, I process it with Python language, natural language processing, simply because it's too much data to a human being to read. I then assembled some variables, for instance, the threat actor, the country which he belongs, the targets, who he was targeting, civilians, military, diplomatic corps. And I built this database based on that. And well, the overview that I was able to provide is quite striking because we don't have just 6 players. We have at least 29 players, and I'm providing you here a map with the 29 countries that actually had some sort of APT attributed to their government to be state-sponsored APTs. and lots of countries that you wouldn't see traditionally. Of course, it varies a lot. You cannot say that the APT related to Yemen, it's as sophisticated as the US or France or UK, of course not. But nevertheless, it's quite surprising. So this was the first thing that struck me, how much information is out there regarding this kind of activity. And just to share also the same view, but from the perspective of cyber offensive capabilities, you see this map on yellow, the countries that at least on more than one occasion acquired cyber capabilities from the private sector or had some sort of information being leaked that indicated that different branches of the government had cyber offensive capabilities. So many of the countries also actually acquired these capabilities lawfully through public means from procurement. So you have the cases from Brazil, and if I'm not particularly wrong about Canada, also it was a law enforcement agency that bought the capabilities. So you can imagine this being used in a judicial framework. So it seems pretty straightforward. However, many of the cases you have intelligence agencies purchasing this kind of capabilities and the military of those nations also. So you can imagine how this capability can and probably will be used in an extraterritorial perspective. Hence the possible escalatory patterns that might come about cyber capabilities. And well, just to share 4 of the consequences that I was able to, sharing a bit of those examples I mentioned, some countries and the entities that acquire them. So you have seen cases from Latin America, for instance, Ecuador, the intelligence agency from Ecuador actually purchased some offensive capabilities back in 2015. So it's something to bear in mind, especially for someone who's coming from Latin America, such as myself. And well, the conclusions from these consequences from these data that I acquired, the first one is obvious that we have power diffusion, but we do not have equality. So we do have many players, but from the data I collected, only 16 countries actually have the capability to develop their own cyber offensive capabilities within their own countries without some external help in any way. So it's diffusion, but not equality for sure. The second point, and I think this is the most striking for me, the idea that geography matters. Once I was able to correlate the origins of the attack with the target, I realized that in 25 of the 29 countries, we had a geopolitical correlation. Countries were targeting their neighbors or at least their geopolitical rivals in the region. So it does seem that cyber is, it's not in ether. It responds to real life and real strategic imperatives in different countries. So it's to put ourselves more with the feet on the ground when we think about cyber. I think it's a nice way to phrase it. A third one was interesting to see that the top list of major capabilities and major targeted countries, they were pretty much the same. They exchanged eventually the position, but they were there. So having cyber offensive capabilities, it seems to be not enough to deter other countries from engaging with cyber actions against your network. So it seems a limit on the strategic sense for cyber capabilities. And the fourth one, I think it's to bear in mind that the original conception from cyberspace, almost as an anarchical or maybe a new groundbreaking frontier, hasn't really realized itself. So we do see a correlation between, I took, for instance, the index from Freedom House, Freedom of the Internet, and correlated with the cyber offensive capabilities purchase. And there's significant correlation between the two. So it seems that cyberspace is being used actually to repress political diversion and not to foment it. So it's really bad. I'm just the last slide to share what exactly I am right now on my research here at King's. I'm focusing on 3 cases: Turkey, UAE, and Vietnam. And I'm trying to study a pattern of evolution from these 3 countries. And they seem to have similar things, but also different characteristics. So my dissertation is focusing on that. And well, of course, the idea of going for a PhD here, because there are cyber emerging powers that came from inertia and went for some domestic action against political opposition and are engaging in regional competition. So why? That's the thing I'm willing to focus on the future. So thank you so much. I leave my contacts, please. Questions, contacts, I'll be happy to address them. Thank you.
Again, thank you for a coaching presentation. And I will say that a lot of what you're talking about has been addressed in the past year by a demi-official account by Cyber Command of its experiences over the past decade. And the concept of cyber deterrence, which used to rank very high on lists of what might happen, certainly seems much more problematical now than it did 10 years ago. So thank you very much. And finally, Sean Lawlor, last but not least.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris, for the opportunity to speak today. I will share my screen. So for my topic, I am speaking on the risk of inadequate risk management and response to cybersecurity events. In 2021, 85.7% of Canadian-based organizations experienced at least one cyber attack that was successful throughout the year. 39% of those had experienced some form of ransomware attack, as we are becoming quite evident that ransomware is becoming a preferred medium for going after organizations for money or for disrupting social image. In 2020, the Communication Security Establishment of Canada reported 2,200 significant cyber incidences against Canadian federal assets, demonstrating that there is a problem that needs to be addressed, and we are working towards, or we need to work towards a solution to ensure that there are none of these incidences that actually make it through into our systems. The threat to Canada comes in that non-allied nations such as Russia, China, North Korea, they all have long established cyber capabilities they have been working on much longer than we have officially been working on ours. And the current cyber capabilities that we do have in Canada, as discussed by Brigadier General Lambert, is that we struggle to adapt them quickly to new situations, and we struggle to apply them accurately and with correct resources. The difference between cyber warfare and traditional warfare is that with traditional warfare, deterrence has always been one of the larger players, especially in our collective defense of NATO. But for cyber threats, it's very difficult to use deterrence as a defensive measure due to the fact that cyber attacks move very, very quickly. They're very difficult to detect immediately, and they're very difficult to react to in any meaningful amount of time. One of the common issues that comes up with cyber attacks is that sometimes it's difficult to learn how they function or learn how to prevent them. Lately, what's been being used, especially by Lockheed Martin, they like to propose cyber kill chains as the end-all be-all for any cyber incident. So they would start with obtaining a foothold in the network, propagating the malware or the attack through the network, and then completing actions on objective. As an engineer, I spend a lot of time working with cyber kill chains and understanding how they work and how we can use them to benefit us or prevent damage being done to our systems. The threat with this lies in, as the Brigadier General mentioned, there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of disinformation, there's a lot of different forms of malware being spread out through the internet. With all of the devices being connected to networks now, the difficulty becomes much, much greater in preventing access to our systems, especially with people. People are a very easy way to maintain or to gain entry to a network or to an organization, as you can put up as many firewalls as you wish, or you can spend as much time as you like testing these firewalls. As soon as somebody clicks on a malicious email, you now have their malware in your system, and in order to prevent it access to the rest of your system, you must find a way to detect it. The risk that this poses to Canadian federal systems is these tools are very easy to develop. They're very simple to develop, and once they're developed, they can be modified and deployed very quickly. The picture here on the left-hand side is a tool that is commonly used for penetration testing in small networks, and it's called Metasploit. It's a relatively small program, and it's not as effective now, as many of the exploits that are on it are very well documented and not as destructive due to that. But it is still able to quickly develop very simple malware that you can use to test your network. Another common tool, as Mr. Rudolf mentioned, is Cobalt Strike. It's quite easy to get a copy of that, and anyone, after spending a little bit of time, can develop their own malware and deploy it wherever they like. In the last 10 years, the amount of monetary damage caused by cybercrime reported to the US has exponentially increased. As you can see, in 2001, we had still a substantial amount of money in terms of damages. However, it does not even begin to compare to the amount of damage caused in 2020 by cyber incidences. In the last few years as well, we've also been able to see that the threats are beginning to rise as the frequency that data breaches have been occurring, as well as the size of the attacks that are being exploited or being introduced are also beginning to increase. In 2020, we set a record for the world's largest DDoS attack, which was 1 terabit per second, which is, it's a lot of data. However, whenever you look at the fact that it was beaten again 3 times in 2021, that shows how quickly that these attacks can progress and become more destructive. For context, in November 2021, the size of the DDoS attack that was picked up by, I believe it was Amazon, was 3.47 terabits per second, which is more than triple the largest DDoS attack from 2020. These threats can be addressed using a lot of education programs and warnings. Particularly the federal government of Canada is beginning to put a lot of time and effort into educating people on the risks of the cyber and trying to make people more aware of how to react to the threats in their own inbox, for example. This is an example of a banner that shows up if you get a email from outside your organization with Microsoft. The second largest change that is being used to change how cyber is working is budgets are being refocused, and they need to continue to be refocused in order to maintain a level of adaptation to the advances in cyber. In 2020, there was a cyber attack against, JBS, which is one of the world's largest meat production facilities, had become the victim of a very large ransomware attack. It completely shut down all American in the US production facilities from May 30th to June 8th. That is not a long period of time. However, there is a lot of production that was being put through those facilities, and it caused a significant backlog to meat supplies in the United States. The reason that this is such an issue is because JBS knew that they had vulnerabilities. They knew that the risks were inadequately managed, but they still chose to not proceed with upgrading their systems after a security audit in 2018 determined that they were vulnerable. The reason that they gave was that there's no immediate return on investments, which will be a continuing issue that we will have in cybersecurity, as it is a very difficult field to invest in, because as the Brigadier General had said, you can invest millions and the response or the outcome from that investment is very difficult to measure. There's also a cyber attack at the Royal Military College in 2020 that caused a substantial amount of discomfort, and another one at the University of Calgary in 2016. The one at Calgary in 2016 was different because we weren't dealing with the pandemic, but they also demonstrated that they were able to continue delivering courses by isolating the compromised parts of their network and continuing to deliver as many services as possible while they repaired the damage. The one at the Royal Military College was a little bit more difficult because of the pandemic, but using the correct mitigation tactics, they were able to ensure that all courses continued and that there was no loss of services. In the next 10 years, the number of devices connected to the internet is expected to grow immensely. As you can see by this graph, it is growing, and it will continue to grow as more and more devices are used by the public and connected to the internet for ease or for personal use. Because of that, the number of vulnerabilities that will be present on a network are also growing, and that is something that will need to be discussed. Not in this presentation, because that's a whole other topic, but that will be something that we need to look at in the future. The biggest issue right now, in my opinion, is that there's a balancing act of public disclosure. If you disclose a exploit or a successful attack against your organization, then that exploit will be tried and attempted against other systems that you own or other systems that other organizations that may interface with you use. The upside to that being, if you publicize an exploit and you say, hey, we were a victim of this, then instead of working with your internal cybersecurity experts, you can then use the collective intelligence of everyone in the field to repair this issue, not only for your organization, but for all other organizations. The downside is that makes you a large target and can damage your public reputation. The response is important because in mitigating attacks, there's always going to be some form of attack that will be successful. You will never ever be able to prevent every attack, and you always have to worry about what will happen whenever somebody gets in. When responding to cyber incidences, the speed at which you respond and the tools and knowledge that you use will be measured, and that will be used if anyone's to try and attack you in the future. To prevent future attacks, a quick response is necessary because it shows that the organization is capable of responding efficiently and competently and minimizes damage. Non-essential services provide a good testing environment because they do not draw as much attention as high-profile networks, as there was with the cyber attack on the Canadian Global Affairs Office. It does draw attention, but it would not draw as much attention as if they had gone after some other form of military infrastructure. Essential services, on the other hand, provide a very high-profile target. They're very high risk and they're very fast response because these essential services have much more resources and time put into developing monitoring systems and response techniques that that can be applied very quickly. That being said, some of them are also connected to these lower profile systems, making them just as vulnerable as the lower profile system. The next 10 years will enforce the precedence that is being set now in cybersecurity. So any of the policies that are made now, any of the changes that are made to doctrine, and any of the ideas that are propagated throughout the industry are going to continue to shape how organizations respond to cyber incidences, and ensuring that correct and beneficial policies are chosen now will continue to make sure that the next 10 years of cybersecurity will be a safe one for the organization, but also one where the organization can grow. And that's all from me, sir. Thank you.